Hi. I know this is normally the part of the video where I do something hilarious or cringy, depending on your perspective, or maybe just roast you guys a little bit. But today I have something else I need to talk about before the proper part of our lecture begins. I need you to understand that today's video is going to happen in two parts. First, I'm going to deliver our content for the day. We're going to wrap up our three-part series on the fourth commandment. Second, I'm going to give you instructions about our upcoming test. That's right, you heard me. We're going to have a test. So after the part of the video that covers the notes and the lesson and the topic for today, there'll be a brief pause, and then there will be instructions about your upcoming test and how to prepare for it. I mention this now so you're not surprised when it totally changes tone on you, and so you make sure to listen all the way through to the end. See you on the other side. God bless. Hello! Welcome back to our morality course. Today, we're going to conclude our three-part series on the fourth commandment. 2 lessons ago, we talked about the family as the cell of society, and we looked at how a married couple and the kids that they produce are basically the building block out of which whole societies and all societies are formed. Last class, we looked at really the core of the fourth commandment. You and your parents, your relationship and the mutual obligations that are necessary to that relationship. Today, we're going to wrap up with a few odd topics, so if it feels a little bit scattered, like we're jumping around rather than moving in order, yeah, that's going to happen. It's kind of the other part of the lesson. 3 things we're going to talk about in this section. We're going to talk about, first, the relationships of families to each other. We talked about how a family is the basic building block. What we're going to look at is, what obligations do families have to each other in a community? Second, we're going to talk about your relationship with the government and the society and the authority figures in your life, and how it's a mirror image of, or a derivative of, your relationship with your parents. Third, we're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between those authority figures, in particular government, and families themselves, and the rights and obligations of each towards each other. So it's going to be family to family, you to government and society, and then family to government and society. Let's get into our first topic. Let's begin. Again, in our Catechism of the Catholic Church, I'm reading from paragraphs 2207 and 2208, and we're going to look at the obligations of families. Not of you to your family or your family to you, but what are the obligations of your family to another family? If society is made up of cells called families, how are these cells supposed to interact with each other? The family is the original cell of social life. That should sound familiar at this point. It is the natural society in which husband and wife are called to give themselves in love and the gift of life, etc., etc., okay. The family is the community in which, from childhood, one can learn moral values, begin to honor God, and make good use of freedom. Family life is an initiation into life in society. How a family conducts itself internally obviously has major ramifications for how you, as a result of that family, will conduct yourself outside in the wider world and community, which means families have a moral obligation to each other in how they raise you. You're right, that's right, your parents don't just have an obligation to you to raise you well, they have an obligation to the community into which you are being brought. And likewise, you don't just have an obligation to your parents to listen to what they say. You have an obligation to all of society to habituate yourself to right relationship with authority figures, which includes, yes, under the appropriate circumstances, obedience. Paragraph 2208. The family should live in such a way that its members learn to care and take responsibility for the young, the old, the sick, the handicapped, and the poor. There are many families who are at times incapable of providing this help. Some families do not have the resources to care for all their members. That leaves you and I, who have resources to do as such, with an obligation. It devolves then on other persons, other families, and in a subsidiary way, society, to provide for their needs. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God and the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. That's a quote from the letter of St. James in the New Testament. Your family has a twofold obligation to care for other families if you have the means. One is that other people in need are people you need to recognize as other people. Just because they're not like you or from your clan or your family or your group, just because they're other doesn't make them any less human. And you must respect that common humanity, the fact that they are also someone's son, someone's daughter, and care for them. That's the obligation, just based on the other person as another person and what's owed to society. But in addition, your family has an obligation to care for people in need insofar as you're able, because that's how you raise members of your family to do so in a larger level. There's a twofold movement going on here. One, you need to care for people because it's the right thing to do because they're people. But two, also, so your kids learn to act well. So you, as a child, learn to act well from your parents. So notice that twofold obligation. That's going to be important because that's going to come up again later in our next section. That's all we're going to talk about today for the obligations of families to one another. If you have resources, you need to be caring for other families who don't. So, we'll move into our second part now. It's about the relationship between you as an individual or a citizen and the society and your obligations to the government of that society. Now take a second and think through this analogy. We talked about the family as the cell, right? Organisms are made up of whole bunches of cells put together. Likewise, a society is made of a whole bunch of families put together. That's the idea here. Now, in an organism, there's usually some central processing sort of center, right? In animals, it's a brain or a nervous system. The idea here is that one part takes on the leadership role, the role of authority, as part of the specializing of different functions. The government is the part of our society that is sort of specialized for central processing, information in, orders out, and organizing everything else around it. It's something like the central nervous system for our human family, if you'll forgive the slightly stretched analogy. Let me give you a simpler one that might be more helpful. In your family, someone is in charge. It's the parents. In your society, someone is in charge. It's the government and other legitimate authority figures. In a totally smug, self-serving way, as I pat myself on the back, one of the groups that's constantly named over and over again throughout the Catechism as a group that needs to be given a high degree of respect, like a parent, like the government, are teachers, because they continue that parental function, which means right after parents, the next group that's always given a high respect, a high honor, a high level of obedience, is teachers and catechists. I'll get off that now. Anyway, your family has someone who is in charge. That's mom and dad. Your society has someone who's in charge. That's the government. That's the police. Yes, that's the tax agencies, right? That's the legislature. That's the judiciary. That's the idea here. Let me read to you a little bit. See if this sounds like our current political discourse. God's fourth commandment also enjoins us to honor all who, for our good, have received authority in society from God, It clarifies the duties of those who exercise authority, as well as those who benefit from it. Parents, children, government, citizens. It's setting up a clear analogy. Two lines I want to read from you. The first is from the duties of civil authorities, the government, and the second is from the duties of citizens, me and you. Let me read you the first one first. I'm in paragraph 2235, by the way. Those who exercise authority should do so as a service. No one can command or establish what is contrary to the dignity of persons and the natural law, etc. Those who serve, who lead, who rule, do so as an act of service. That's how our faith portrays government and leadership. It's an act of service. You serve your community, you serve your state, you serve your town by going and doing this extra work of being in the legislature, right? Or even serving on a jury. It's an act of service. You do it to make everything a better place, not to line your pockets or to gain authority or to push your own agenda. Anyway, the duties of citizens. Those subject to authority should regard those in authority as representatives of God, who has made them stewards of his gifts. That's 2238. Now take a second and let that sink in. We, as people subject to authority, should treat legitimate government authority and the people who wield it as representatives of God. In the last lecture, we talked about God as your father before your father is your father, right? Here, the government is your father in a parallel way. We would never talk smack about an elected representative, would we? We would never insult them or use derogatory terms about them. You would never say, for example, that the person who happens to be the president right now, or 8 years ago, or in 8 years, is an idiot or a fool or a jerk. That kind of slander is totally inappropriate and disrespectful. You would not curse God because you don't agree with one of his decisions. And if you do, it's the grave sin of blasphemy. You would never curse our government or government officials for their sometimes less than perfect behavior, would you? And if you do, you should probably consider bringing that to confession. Yes, governmental authority deserves a high degree of respect, just like your parents deserve a high degree of respect. That's very different than American civil discourse. Now we have an obligation, and I'll lay this out for us a little later. We have an obligation to, say, criticize or make known our needs when the government doesn't fulfill it. But please be aware, when you criticize, you're criticizing the action, the policy, the decision. You are never attacking the person. Think carefully about your political discourse. If there's a whole party you reject, be very, very careful in your speech that you are politely and civilly criticizing positions and approaches and not trash-talking people. That would be gravely evil. And yes, that's serious enough that you should be bringing it to confession if that's been going on in your life. This is our model. Father, government figures, even the ones who aren't from your party. Now, just from that analogy, we can figure out further what the obligations are. What were the, if you can remember our diagram from last time, the things you owe your parents? Obedience, respect, and care. And likewise, they provide those things for you, right? So let's go through care first. How does your government and your society care for you? Well, they provide things like public safety, security, the fact that we have, say, a power grid and running water. Those are all government functions. They're run by your city. The fact that there is a school system, so people who can't afford expensive private prep school education, people who aren't that privileged, still get to go to full-time school at their public school district, right? Those are all society and government functions. That's the government caring for families. We likewise must care back for our community. You don't get to be 100% checked out of what's going on in your community or even what's going on in the government. You don't need to know every detail, and you certainly don't need to watch or read the news every day. That would be a huge information overdose, and probably you're having a hard time praying every day if you're actually reading news media every single day, or you need prayers more. But anyway, you got to know what's going on, and you got to be involved to a certain extent. Next, the obligation of respect. We just talked about that a minute ago in terms of respecting the people, but it also means respecting the authority, right? Yes, if a police officer pulls you over, you really do need to roll down the window and come to a stop and hold your hands at 10 and 2 and follow the procedure that they've asked you to. That's out of respect for the officer and the dangerous situation he's in. You really do need to respect that, say, the government authorities get to tell you what to do some of the time, and you need to not mock or ridicule for it. And likewise, they need to respect you as a citizen and as a person. This is where it gets thorny in our culture. The government has absolutely no authority to make a law that fails to respect human nature. If the government tried to pass a law saying it's totally okay to murder people as long as they're, I don't know, pick a particular race or religion, we would reject that law. It fails to respect human dignity. Incidentally, our government has done that. All it said is you're allowed to murder someone as long as it's before they're born, right? As long as they're still in their mother's womb, they're totally fair game to kill. Roe v. Wade and KCV Planned Parenthood. And again, it's an unjust law that needs to be rejected. We're back at our old principle from Aquinas, by the way, and I'm sure you guys remember this one. Say it along with me now. An unjust law is good. What that principle is getting at is this rule here. The government must respect what it means for you to be human. You need an education. You need food and water. You need shelter. Your family needs protecting. Now, please note, this respect is not just a function of individual human rights. It's an issue of family rights, because the family is the cell it's required to protect. So a government that tries to say, well, having access to, say, drugs, alcohol, pornography, things that destroy families is an individual right, has still failed to hold its obligation of respect. It has not respected the family, which is always damaged by those things, especially in large quantities and habitual actions, right? Government needs to respect individuals as members of families, which means it must protect and support families as families. And likewise, you must respect the government as the legitimate authority. Obedience was high up on our list, right, of things you owe to your parents, because your parents have the role of educating and forming you. You really do have to obey most of what the government says most of the time. You really do have to pay your taxes. You really have to serve jury duty. Those are serious obligations. That's part of how you participate in being a community. Imagine being a member of your family where you don't pull your weight. You don't do the chores mom and dad assign to you. You don't participate in family life, but you still show up and expect a bed and a meal all the time. That's not pulling your weight in a family. Likewise, you don't get to not pull your weight in society. You want to benefit from the fact that you live in a free society where things like free speech, freedom of religion, free expression, a very healthy economy, even despite the current situation we're in, and, not having to worry about being shot or blown up or anything like that, almost all the time, guess what? None of that's free. You have obligations to participate in those things. If your family, your parents, your siblings, etc., were under physical attack, I bet you would feel obligated to help out however you can. I bet you would rise to the defense of your family. So if your nation is under attack, you have an obligation to participate in the defense of your country. Now, that doesn't mean you necessarily have to sign up for the military, but it does mean there is good cause, especially if it's for the self-defense of your own citizens under attack. Again, the parallel that we're looking for in your obligations to your government and your government's obligations to you are based on you to your father or you to your mother. Would you rise to her protection? Then you need to rise to its protection. Just like you should be proud of your family and enthusiastic about your family and our traditions, right? Like, that's a good, healthy vibe. Patriotism, love of your own country. is appropriate, reasonable, even expected. You should be patriotic. You should love your country. You should be proud of your country. You absolutely should criticize particular policies and decisions it gets wrong. I just gave you a great example of that a minute ago, calling out a couple of incorrect Supreme Court decisions. But you need to love it. And those criticisms need to come from a place of love. Just like you might disagree with some things your parents say, but you still love your family. One last point about obedience to government authority. In the last lecture, we talked about the conditions under which you should and must disobey your parents. And it was a question of moral evil. The only time under which you should, and under these conditions you must, disobey, blatantly violate the expectation of obedience, is if your parents order you to do something evil. A bad moral object, an intrinsically evil action, etc. Something seriously bad. That's true at the government level as well. If the government orders you to take up arms against innocent people, you say no, and you non-violently resist. The biggest example that you guys probably have learned about is the civil rights movement of sort of non-violent resistance, right? Think sit-ins and marches. Those are morally good actions. There is limited scope for disobedience against an authority when it tries to impose unjust laws. The government doesn't get to abuse you in that particular way. It doesn't get you to order you to do evil. By the way, even when you're in a state where you are rebelling against a particular action that the government is trying to impose on you, you still have to do things like pay your taxes and love your country and support it. You don't get to go into full rebellion mode. You resist that particular order, and you still participate enthusiastically in your community and in your society. Again, one last point. I have a difficult question. I don't even really want to ask, but I have to mention it. It comes up in our catechism and it's worth pointing out. Under what circumstances would it be morally good for you to raise your fist to your father? For you to actually physically assault and fight against your own parents? Now, I apologize if any of you have experience in a case like that. I am sorry for dredging up that memory. It cannot be a happy one, and please forgive me. For the rest of us, it's hard to even picture a time that would be a good thing, right? Like, that's so shocking and far away from most of our experience. It's hard to even pin down how that would happen. That's also true of armed rebellion against your own society. And there is a clause in there that's worth pointing out. There are extremely limited circumstances under which it is right to violently rebel against the imposed government. And it's in cases of extreme injustice that are continually being perpetrated, and when there's literally no better option. So if you're worried that it sounds like the church is way too chummy with keeping the status quo and authority, it's not. It just recognizes that violence should almost never be the answer, and even when it is, things have already gone so horribly wrong. So while there is reasonable, limited, moderate room for disobedience, that's very different than violence or rebellion, which is extremely limited in its scope. And again, all of this makes perfect sense when you consider the analogy to parents. If the government is in the role of your parents, when would you obey them? When would you disobey them? When would it be right to do so? How would it be right to speak about them? And how should you participate in what they ask you to participate in? So, part 3. We're going to talk about the relationship between government and society and families. And this is really just going to be an application of something we've talked about already. In the lesson on the cell of society, being the family, we talked about how the function of government, the function of society, is to protect and support families in their distinct mission as families. What we're going to get here is just a quick list of what exactly that means, what policies are necessary here. So, I'm in our catechism and I'm reading especially from paragraph 2211. The political community has a duty to honor the family, to assist it, and to ensure especially, and here's our list. 1. the freedom to establish a family, have children, and bring them up in keeping with the family's own moral and religious convictions. Families get to be families, and they get to raise their kids the way they believe in, not necessarily the way the government believes in. 2, the protection of the stability of the marriage bond and the institution of the family. If you don't protect the principle of a family, then lots of forces in society have a vested interest or an economic interest in ripping family members apart. This is why it's important for government to have strong laws supporting marriage, and that means, by the way, things like making marriage economically beneficial, think tax status, right? Or not making divorce too easy, so it's not easy to break up families, etc. 3, the freedom to profess one's own faith, to hand it on, and to raise one's children in it with the necessary means and institutions. The government needs to make sure it's not in the way of churches, because that's necessary to groups handing on their faith. If the government decided everyone had to go to a government school, as totalitarian governments often do, I wouldn't be able to help bring you up in your faith, and you would never get to learn more about your faith than, say, your parents can teach you. Protection for the institutions that hand on a family's identity, including their religious identity. The right to private property, to free enterprise, to obtain work and housing, and the right to emigrate. Private property is important. That is a right. The government doesn't get to usurp and take control of all private property and decide that it controls all of it and it's going to delegate it. That's the violence of communism, and communism is explicitly condemned throughout the theology of our faith because it's violent against families and their right of self-determination. Violates their ability to decide who they're going to be and how. To free enterprise, likewise, to obtain work and housing. People have a right to do some kind of productive work and to have appropriate housing. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean the government has to give that to them. The government's not the same as society, but the government does need to make sure the social preconditions are there for that. If someone doesn't exercise their right to work or doesn't obtain housing, it doesn't necessarily mean the government has to do it for them. It does need to mean the government's going to ensure the preconditions of getting there. Supporting charities and making local churches that give out these things is equally valid to, say, taxing the populace and redistributing the wealth. And often it's less messy. The right to emigrate, that's important. What does it tell you about a country when it doesn't let its people leave? People need to have the right to leave their country. It certainly keeps that country honest. Citizens are not slaves. Right to emigrate. In keeping with the country's institutions, the right to medical care, assistance for the aged, and family benefits. Again, in keeping with the country's institutions. In some countries, the government does this directly. In other countries, the government leaves this up to private enterprise, but sets laws to make sure that private enterprise actually gets it done. Both are perfectly valid. There's no obligation here, by the way, to be socialist or to be free market libertarian. There's reasonable room for both of those. Policy disagreements about how we get to these ends are good, reasonable debate. You're going to get really economically, really socially conservative Catholics and really economically, socially liberal Catholics. And within certain limits, those are perfectly reasonable positions. They have different ideas about politics and economics and what's more efficient for getting people what they need, as long as we're all clear we're aiming at the same end. Support for the family to do the family's job of raising children and of bringing up moral and therefore happy people into our society. In keeping with the country's institutions, again, different ways of getting there, the right to medical care, assistance for the aged, and family benefits. Families need support, and everyone needs health care. It's just human nature, right? That's how we care for people. The protection of security and health, especially with respect to dangers like drugs, pornography, alcoholism, etc. You need to protect your people from disease as best you can. Our government is aggressively pursuing policies to do that. Whether or not they're too aggressive or not aggressive enough, you could debate all you want, not the time or place in this lecture. But they're trying sincerely and very visibly to keep us safe from disease, like coronavirus. Are they trying as hard to keep us safe from drug addiction, from gambling addiction, from pornography addiction? Those are also diseases, illnesses, from which families need protecting. The freedom to form associations with other families, and so to have representation before civil authority. You have a right to make your voice heard. Every member of a family needs to have some level of voice. They don't all have authority. It's not necessary to have democracy. I mean, simply put, if you're in a family with lots of siblings, imagine what would happen if everything was run democratically and you and your siblings could outvote your parents. Think about some of the decisions you would have made as kids and some of the ones you still might make now as teens. But it is necessary that your parents at least be willing to hear you out on what your needs are. That's what this means by a voice. Democracy is not morally obligatory. Again, it's one good way of trying to make sure everyone has a shot at being able to express their needs and have their needs met by the government. That's what's essential. Everyone gets heard, everyone gets met. That's the short list we get. Things that the government owes to families. Freedom to establish a family, protection for the institution of marriage, freedom to raise children within one's faith, private property, free enterprise, work and housing and emigration, medical care, assistance for the aged and family benefits, protection of security and health, both regarding to disease, but also to moral disease and mental illness like addiction, and freedom to form associations and have some form of representation. Again, pretty wise book, isn't it? It's all logical and it all follows from our understanding, one, of what it means to be human, to have that high level of human dignity, and two, from what it means to be a family. Now, before we wrap up and finish, I want to raise one bonus point. Just one more thing that you guys could figure out. If the government represents the parents, as it were, of a society, and if families have obligations to care for other families, what obligation do you think nations have towards other nations? Think that through for a second. Do well-off nations that have lots and lots of resources have an obligation to help care for other countries? Do families have obligations to care for other families? Make sense? Let's wrap up. We looked at 3 different things today, and they're a little scattered, but they all kind of fit into the whole we've been working on. We looked first at the obligations of families to other families, and especially it's one of care. Your family needs to care for other families because 1, that's how they teach you to care for other people, and 2, because other families deserve and need that treatment as a function of their own human dignity. 2, we looked at your obedience and respect to the government and their obedience and their authority over and care for you, and the different obligations and the ways you generally should just obey. 3, we looked at how government is supposed to relate to families and the things it has to guarantee families in order to be doing its job as government. Thank you so much for tuning in. God bless. So, as I mentioned in the beginning of today's lecture, I want to take a few moments now and talk about the test we're going to take next class. It's a little strange, we're taking a test in this digital school situation, but we've certainly covered the appropriate amount of material, and it's not like we're going to keep doing school and I'm going to keep teaching you without checking in to help you consolidate all that learning and, well, see how much you've actually been picking up on. So, let's talk about our test. First of all, our test is going to be next class during the regular scheduled period. So this is lesson number 7. You guys are seeing this either Wednesday or Thursday morning. Our test is going to happen during class number 8, during lesson number 8. So if you are in G period, Your test is on Friday from 11 a.m. to 12:15. Please note, I'm going to hold very strictly to those times. Your test does not begin at 10:59. It does not begin at 11:01. It begins at 11. If you have been having any kind of technical difficulties, internet connection issues, uploading issues, whatever have been the problems you've experienced, I am trusting that you troubleshoot all of those issues before our test begins, because I'm expecting that you are actually ready to start at 11 a.m. Excuse me. Likewise, juniors, we're going to start Monday morning, 8 a.m. Yes, it's a Monday morning first period test. Yes, I expect both your brain and your computer in perfect working order at exactly 8 a.m., not 8:01. I know that's a little strict. I also know you can handle it. Next, the format of our test. Here's what you can expect. First, a very brief YouTube video, giving you a little bit of instructors, a few pointers, last minute information, etc. It's not going to be a full-length lecture. Don't expect it to be more than 5 minutes. But there will be a video for you to watch at the beginning of the period. Excuse me. Second, you should be prepared to receive a Google Doc. I'm going to make a Google Doc for each one of you, separate from one another. I'm going to share it with you. And you're going to do your work in that Google Doc. So if you've had problems with sharing Google Docs with me before, we've practiced this twice now, remember? That wasn't by accident. You need to get those problems solved before our test begins. As you're watching the lesson, the video that's at the beginning of your test, I will be sending out to all of you your doc in which you're going to do your work. I'm going to watch your doc very carefully. I am requiring that you do all of the work for your test in that doc. You may not do your work somewhere else, like on paper, or like in a different tab, or like in a different document, and then copy and paste it in. If I see you copying and pasting anything that isn't an exact quote that you're going to cite, you will be given a 0 and penalized for cheating. I'm going to give you a doc. I'm going to require you to work in the doc. I'm going to watch you work in the doc live. That's as close as I can come to anti-cheating measures. You know how seriously I take those. You know the level of scrutiny you'll be under. Next, that doc is going to have questions. They're going to be sentence and paragraph length questions. I haven't told you how many. I haven't told you if you're going to answer all of them or skip them all, etc. That's all stuff you're going to find out on test day. Most of what I'm going to be testing you on are the lectures. I'm going to test you on the lectures we've had so far. I'll give you a brief run through in case you've forgotten. Lecture number 1 was about the 3 theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. And it led right into lecture number 2, which was on the first 3 commandments. It's where I introduced to you those 3 books: Bible, Catechism, Code of Canon Law. Lesson number 3 was about the family as the cell of society. Lesson number 4 and 5, we did a reflection exercise. Those are not on the test. Lesson number 6, which you're watching, lesson number 6, was about your obligations to your parents and your parents' obligations to you. Lesson number 7 is the one we're in right now. It wraps up the 4th commandment. So you had 2 lessons, 1 and 2 on the first 3 commandments, and then you had 3 lessons, lessons number 3, 6, and 7 on the 4th commandment. That's the content for our test. If while you've been watching these lectures, you have been taking your own notes, you're already pretty well prepared. Organize your notes and review them. You can have them out in front of you during the test, that's fine. If you haven't been taking notes on these lectures, you might want to. One way to prepare for the test would be to rewatch lectures and take notes on them. The test is going to ask you critical thinking questions based on the lectures. I'm not going to ask you to repeat a point from the lectures. I'm going to ask you to apply, interpret, analyze, compare and contrast, all those hard thinking words that I like to make you do in sentences so I get to see the gears turning. I'm going to give you a handful of questions and you're going to answer them. They're going to be based on the lectures. So if you have notes in front of you, great. That's a wonderful cheat sheet to bring to your test. Here's the last thing you need to know in your test. It's timed. Our tests start at, where was it? Again, G period, 11 a.m. Friday. A period, 8 a.m. Monday. They end at 12:15 and 9:15 sharp. Your test does not end at 12:14 or 12:16. It ends at exactly 12:15. A period, your test does not end at 9:14 or 9:16. It ends at exactly 9:15. I'm going to be watching in the doc. I am only going to give you credit for stuff that gets written before 9:15. That's a hard deadline. If you plan on looking at the questions and then going back and pulling up the videos and watching and clicking and finding the place, you're never going to finish. I'm assuming when you come into that test on that day, you already pretty much have all your resources at your fingertips. You might want to pull up a tab with a Catechism of the Catholic Church or with a Bible. That would be a great way to be prepared because it might help your argument or your sentence or your paragraph to quote a book of the Bible or to quote the Catechism of the Catholic Church. You can do that. You can have those resources ready. Basically, this test should be pretty easy if you've prepared very well. And if you haven't, this is why I'm giving you the heads up now. So quick rundown on our test. It's during the class period. It will be sent to you as a Google Doc where you will do all of your work. You'll be answering sentence and paragraph length questions that assume you already know the lectures pretty well and ask you to think about them. Not recite information from the lectures, but having already understood the information in the lectures can talk about it in your own words. You will do all of your work in that doc, and you'll do it all during class time. Anything done after class time ends, you will not get credit for. So, spend some time between now and Friday or between now and Monday brushing up on those lectures, checking that you have a high quality outline. Maybe all you need to do is copy and paste my outline from the description. Maybe that's enough for you. Sure, cool. If you took good notes, feel free to share them with classmates. You'll have an hour and 15 minutes to work. Really, it'll be more like an hour and 10 after the video. If you have any questions, bring them up in the live stream that we're going to start in a few minutes. I look forward to seeing you for your test. God bless.